The morning of August 28, 1944, a coastal gun battery near Dover, England. Lieutenant Colonel James Harrison stood at his observation post, binoculars trained on the grey Channel sky, waiting for the sound that had terrorised southeastern England for nearly 3 months. At 6:47 a.m., he heard it. The distinctive pulse jet engine of a Vergeltungswaffe, the vengeance weapon, what the British had grimly nicknamed the doodlebug or buzz bomb. The V-1 appeared as a small cross against the clouds, travelling at approximately 400 miles per hour, its ramjet engine producing that characteristic rattling roar. Harrison's gun crews had been waiting. The 3.7-inch anti-aircraft guns traversed smoothly, tracking the approaching weapon. Fire control radar provided precise ranging data. The guns fired in a carefully coordinated barrage. What happened next would have seemed impossible just 6 weeks earlier. The first shell exploded 30 feet from the V-1's fuselage, not on impact with the missile itself, but in midair, detonating with perfect timing as it passed within lethal range. Shrapnel tore through the V-1's thin metal skin, severing control cables and puncturing the fuel tank. The flying bomb pitched downward and exploded harmlessly in an empty field 2 miles short of its target. Harrison watched through his binoculars as his guns engaged the next V-1 that appeared 20 minutes later. Same result? Midair burst, V-1 destroyed. By noon, his battery had fired at 14 vones-second, 13 had been destroyed before reaching the coast. This was not luck. This was technology that German commanders had concluded was theoretically impossible, now deployed in quantities that turned Britain's coastal defences into an impenetrable barrier. The story of how 352 V-1 flying bombs were shot down in a single week, and how German commanders reacted when they finally understood what they were facing, begins not with the V-1 campaign itself, but with a weapon that Germany had spent a decade trying and failing to develop. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The proximity fuse, despite its deceptively simple concept, represented one of the most sophisticated pieces of miniaturized electronics produced during World War II. Inside a steel casing roughly 8 inches long and weighing just over 2 pounds, American engineers had packed a complete radio transmitter and receiver, a power source, safety mechanisms, and a detonator. This device had to survive being fired from a gun at accelerations exceeding 20,000 times the force of Earth's gravity, then function perfectly during the few seconds of flight time before reaching its target. Germany had explored proximity fuse development as early as 1930, developing over 30 different designs. The Kronke acoustic fuse used mechanical tone filters. Rheinmetall-Borsig developed electrostatic detection systems. There were optical fuses, magnetic fuses, and experimental radio fuses conceptually similar to what the Americans eventually built. But by 1939, German researchers had reached a unanimous conclusion. The technical challenges were insurmountable given available technology. The miniaturized vacuum tubes required simply could not survive artillery acceleration forces. Hitler's leadership issued directives in 1940, prioritizing only projects that could reach production within 6 months to support the coming invasion of the Soviet Union. Germany's proximity fuse programs were terminated, though limited work would resume at Rheinmetall-Borsig in 1944, far too late to affect the war's outcome. The British had progressed further. Researchers at the Telecommunications Research Establishment had conceived of using miniature Doppler radar systems. They built prototypes that functioned perhaps 50% of the time under ideal conditions. But Britain's industrial capacity was stretched to breaking, and the costs were astronomical. The British shared their research through the Tizard mission when America entered the war. But it would be American scientists and American industry that actually made it work. The National Defense Research Committee, formed on June 27, 1940, brought together leading American physicists under the direction of Vannevar Bush. Merle Tuve, a physicist whose brilliant but volatile temperament drove the effort, led a team that eventually numbered over 1,000 scientists and engineers at what became the Applied Physics Laboratory of Johns Hopkins University. Working initially from a rented Chevrolet garage in Silver Spring, Maryland, the team settled on a radio-based proximity fuse using Doppler radar principles. The engineering challenges were extraordinary. When a 5-inch artillery shell is fired, it accelerates from 0 to 2,600 feet per second in roughly 20 feet of gun barrel. Every component experiences a crushing force equivalent to being struck by a sledgehammer, while simultaneously spinning at 25,000 revolutions per minute. After surviving this violence, the delicate electronics had to function perfectly. James Van Allen, a young physicist who joined the Applied Physics Laboratory in April 1942, faced the task of developing what the team called rugged vacuum tubes. Starting with miniature tubes that Raytheon and Sylvania had developed for hearing aids, Van Allen redesigned them from first principles. The glass envelopes were thickened and carefully annealed. Internal filaments and grids were redesigned with shorter spans and heavier cross-sections. The tubes were potted in wax inside the fuse body to cushion them against shock. Through hundreds of test firings at the Naval Proving Grounds in Dahlgren, Virginia, and thousands of design iterations, the team gradually developed tubes that could survive. By September 1941, they were achieving success rates above 50%. The Navy, desperate for any improvement in anti-aircraft effectiveness, accepted this failure rate and authorized mass production tooling. By early 1943, reliability had climbed above 90%. Production began slowly but accelerated rapidly. 5 major companies manufactured the fuses: Crosley Corporation, Radio Corporation of America, Eastman Kodak, General Electric, and McQuay Norris. By late 1943, American factories were producing 40,000 fuses per day. Over the course of the war, American industry produced more than 22 million proximity fuses at a cost exceeding $1 billion 1940s dollars. More than 100 factories participated in some phase of production. Security surrounding the proximity fuse was second only to the Manhattan Project. The device was given the deliberately misleading code name VT Fuse, supposedly standing for variable time, to disguise its true nature. Workers signed secrecy oaths and were searched entering and leaving facilities. They did not know what they were building. Most critically, the Pentagon strictly forbade use of the fuse over land throughout most of the war. The risk was too great that a dud shell would fall into enemy hands where German or Japanese engineers might reverse engineer the technology. Intelligence analysts estimated that if Germany equipped its anti-aircraft guns with proximity fuses, bomber losses could increase by 300%. The strategic air campaign might become impossible, so the fuses were used only over water, where dud shells would sink beyond enemy reach. This absolute security restriction held firm through the invasions of North Africa, Sicily, and Italy. When a dud proximity fused shell landed on Sicily in July 1943, headquarters dispatched a special patrol to recover it before German forces could find it. Then, on June 13, 1944, Germany unleashed a new weapon that would force a complete recalculation of acceptable risk. The first V-1 flying bomb struck London at 4:25 a.m. It was unlike anything the Allies had faced before. The V-1 was essentially a pilotless aircraft powered by a pulse jet engine. It carried an 1,870-pound warhead and flew at speeds approaching 400 miles per hour at altitudes between 2,000 and 3,000 feet. Small, fast, and arriving without warning, the V-2 were extraordinarily difficult to intercept. The psychological impact was immediate and devastating. Unlike conventional bombing raids, which came at predictable times and could be detected by radar, giving time for shelters, the V-2 arrived at all hours. The distinctive sound of their pulse jet engines, a loud buzzing or sputtering roar, could be heard for miles. Londoners learned to fear the moment when the engine cut out, which meant the bomb was beginning its terminal dive. There was perhaps 15 seconds between engine cut-off and impact. From June through late August 1944, Germany launched over 9,000 V-2 against Britain. The pilotless missiles inflicted over 6,000 civilian deaths and caused 24,000 casualties. Entire neighborhoods were destroyed. The attacks threatened to break civilian morale in a way that years of conventional bombing had not. British defences were initially overwhelmed. Fighter aircraft could intercept V-2, but only the fastest planes could catch them, and interception had to occur over the Channel or southern England, giving little margin for error. Some RAF pilots developed the technique of flying alongside a V-1 and using their wingtip to flip the flying bomb's gyroscope, sending it into an uncontrolled dive. This required extraordinary skill and nerve. Anti-aircraft guns defending London initially could destroy only 17% of the V-2 that entered the coastal gun belt. The problem was fundamental. Conventional anti-aircraft fire required either a direct hit on a small, fast-moving target or a timed fuse set to explode at a predetermined altitude. Setting timed fuses required knowing exactly where the target would be when the shell arrived. Against an aircraft travelling at 400 miles per hour, this calculation was nearly impossible. Even with the latest radar-directed fire control systems, the majority of shells exploded too early, too late, too high, or too low to damage the target. General Frederick Pyle, commanding Anti-Aircraft Command, described the situation in desperate terms. His guns were firing thousands of rounds daily with minimal results. Each V-1 that penetrated the coastal defences had roughly an 80% chance of reaching London. The mathematics were brutal. If Germany could sustain the launch rate, British casualties would become unsustainable. Civilian evacuation from London had begun again for the first time since 1940. The government feared panic. Winston Churchill convened emergency meetings with military commanders and scientific advisors. The situation was discussed at the highest levels. Britain needed a solution, and needed it immediately. The only technology that could dramatically improve anti-aircraft effectiveness was the American proximity fuse. But using proximity fuses over land meant abandoning the security restrictions that had been absolute policy since 1942. It meant accepting that dud fuses would fall on British soil where, potentially, German commandos or agents might recover them. It meant gambling that the immediate tactical advantage outweighed the strategic risk. Churchill made the decision personally. On June 17, 1944, just 4 days after the first V-1 attack, he authorised the use of proximity fuses in anti-aircraft guns defending Britain. The order was classified at the highest level. Even the existence of proximity fuses remained secret from the British public. American authorities were informed and concurred. Modified fuses were rushed into production, specifically calibrated for the small, fast V-2. The standard proximity fuse was designed to detonate near large aircraft. The V-1, despite its speed, was smaller. The fuzes required adjustment to ensure they would trigger at the optimal distance from these diminutive targets. British and American anti-aircraft batteries along the southern coast were re-equipped with proximity-fused ammunition. The deployment happened with remarkable speed. By early July, thousands of proximity fuses were arriving daily at coastal gun positions. Crews were trained on the new ammunition, with minimal explanation. They were told only that the new shells were more effective and that absolute secrecy was required. Gunners were ordered to report any dud rounds immediately so they could be recovered before anyone examined them. The first large-scale test of proximity-fused anti-aircraft fire against V-2 occurred during the week of July 17 through July 23, 1944. General Pyle had reorganised his entire defence system. Anti-aircraft guns were moved from London itself to a concentrated belt along the coast. The strategy was to engage the V-2 as they crossed the Channel, destroying them over water or over the sparsely populated coastal areas before they could reach London. The results were immediate and dramatic. During the week of July 17th, coastal anti-aircraft guns engaged 263 V-2. 91 were destroyed. This represented a destruction rate of 34%, double the previous rate. But this was just the beginning. As gun crews gained experience with the proximity-fused ammunition and as more batteries were equipped, the effectiveness increased rapidly. By late July, the destruction rate had climbed to 52%. By mid-August, it reached 67%. The week of August 28th through September 3rd, 1944, marked the peak of anti-aircraft effectiveness against the V-1 threat. During this single week, British and American coastal anti-aircraft batteries engaged 502 V-1 flying bombs. 352 were destroyed before reaching their targets. This represented a destruction rate of 70%. On one particular day, August 28th, the same morning when Lieutenant Colonel Harrison watched his battery engage 14 vones second, anti-aircraft guns across the entire coastal defense belt engaged 82 vones second. 68 were destroyed. 83% success rate in a single day. The guns were working in conjunction with improved radar systems and advanced fire control computers, but the proximity fuse was the critical technology that made the difference. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The effect on German V-1 operations was catastrophic. Launch crews at sites across northern France could see their weapons being destroyed in massive numbers. The V-1 campaign had been predicated on overwhelming British defences through sheer volume. Germany had invested enormous resources in building launch sites and producing the flying bombs. Each V-1 cost approximately 5,000 Reichsmarks to manufacture, representing significant allocation of materials, labour, and industrial capacity. From the German perspective, the sudden collapse of V-1 effectiveness was inexplicable. Intelligence reports from agents in Britain confirmed that massive numbers of vones second were being shot down, but German commanders could not understand how. Conventional anti-aircraft fire simply should not have been this effective against small, fast-moving targets. The mathematics did not work. Something had changed, but German intelligence could not determine what. Colonel Max Wachtel, commanding Flak Regiment 155, the specialized unit responsible for V-1 operations, reported to his superiors that defensive effectiveness had increased beyond any reasonable expectation. His launch crews were observing vones second exploding in midair, far short of their targets. The explosions were consistent with anti-aircraft fire, but the volume of successful interceptions was impossible given known British capabilities. Wachtel's reports filtered up through Luftwaffe command to Field Marshal Erhard Milch and ultimately to Hermann Göring himself. The Reichsmarschall demanded explanations. How were the British destroying 70% of the vones second? German intelligence agencies, including the Abwehr and the SD, were tasked with determining what new weapon or technology the British had deployed. German agents in Britain were largely compromised by this point in the war, part of the elaborate double-cross system, where captured spies sent carefully controlled information back to Germany. But even controlled intelligence had to contain enough truth to be believable. The double-cross committee faced a delicate problem. If they reported that a new type of anti-aircraft shell was being used, it might prompt German investigation. But if they reported nothing, the Germans would know their intelligence network had been compromised. The solution was to provide partial truth. Controlled German agents reported that British anti-aircraft defences had been reorganised and that American gun crews with advanced radar systems had been deployed to the coastal belt. This was factually accurate. What was not mentioned was the proximity fuse. German commanders accepted these reports. They concluded that improved radar, fire control, and concentrated deployment of guns explained the increased effectiveness. This conclusion was reasonable but wrong. Meanwhile, British intelligence was monitoring German reactions closely. Bletchley Park, having broken German military codes, could read Luftwaffe communications regarding V-1 operations. The decrypted messages revealed German confusion and mounting frustration. Launch rates increased as Germany attempted to overwhelm the defences through sheer numbers, but the increased launch rate only resulted in more vones second being destroyed. The exchange ratio was unsustainable. By September 1944, the V-1 campaign was effectively defeated. Allied ground forces advancing through France captured the launch sites, forcing Germany to cease operations. But during the 3 months of intensive V-1 attacks, proximity fuzes had proven their worth beyond any doubt. Winston Churchill, writing after the war, stated that the proximity fuse made possible the successes that anti-aircraft command was obtaining. He noted that without this technology, British defences would have remained inadequate, and the V-1 campaign might have achieved its objective of breaking civilian morale, but the full story of German reactions to the proximity fuse was still to come. Throughout the V-1 campaign, the fuses had been used over Britain, not over German-controlled territory. Some dud rounds fell on British soil and were quickly recovered by bomb disposal teams. But German forces never captured an intact fuse during this period. That would change in December 1944 during the Battle of the Bulge. On December 16, 1944, General Dwight Eisenhower formally requested authorization to use proximity fuses without restriction in the European theatre. On December 21, all limits were lifted. Over the next 6 weeks, 200,000 proximity-fused artillery shells were fired against German forces. For the first time, German soldiers and engineers encountered the technology directly. The impact was immediate. German soldiers who had survived years of combat on the Eastern Front described proximity-fused artillery fire as unlike anything they had experienced. Conventional artillery exploded on impact with the ground. Soldiers in foxholes or trenches had reasonable protection, but proximity-fused shells exploded 20 to 50 feet above the ground, showering shrapnel down into protective positions. Foxholes became death traps. Lieutenant Werner Pohlmann, a Wehrmacht officer captured in January 1945, was among the first German prisoners to be thoroughly interrogated about reactions to the new ammunition. His testimony, preserved in Allied intelligence files, provides remarkable insight into the German perspective. Pohlmann had commanded an infantry company during the Ardennes offensive. On December 24, Christmas Eve, his unit came under American artillery fire near Bastogne. The shells, he reported, exploded in the air with perfect consistency. Every single round detonated at optimal height for anti-personnel effect. His men had no defense. The attack lasted approximately 20 minutes and inflicted 70% casualties on his company. Pohlmann himself survived by pure chance, having been in a stone building that provided overhead protection. When the barrage ended, he found his company combat ineffective. Half his men were dead or wounded. The survivors were in shock. But what struck Pohlmann most was not the casualties themselves. Combat soldiers expected losses. What disturbed him was the implication of what he had witnessed. The technology required to make every artillery shell explode at optimal height, regardless of terrain or conditions, represented capabilities he had not imagined America possessed. Pohlmann was an educated officer. He had studied engineering before the war. He understood the technical challenges involved in creating a proximity fuse. During his interrogation, Pohlmann asked his American captors directly, "How did the fuses work?" The interrogators, following security protocols, refused to provide details. But they did confirm that the technology was based on radio detection. Pohlmann's reaction was recorded in the interrogation transcript. He stated that Germany had concluded such a device was impossible to mass produce. German engineers had explored the concept, he said, but determined that miniaturized radio transmitters could not survive artillery acceleration forces. The interrogator asked Pohlmann what conclusion he drew from the existence of American proximity fuzzes. His answer was remarkably candid. He said it demonstrated that American industrial capacity was fundamentally different from German capacity. Germany could innovate, but could not manufacture sophisticated technology in unlimited quantities. America could do both. The proximity fuse required not just technical brilliance, but massive manufacturing infrastructure, quality control systems, and acceptance of high costs. Only America possessed such capacity. Other German prisoners provided similar testimonies. A Luftwaffe engineer captured in February 1945 had examined recovered fragments of proximity-fused shells. He identified the miniature vacuum tubes and attempted to understand the circuitry. His conclusion, shared during interrogation, was that each fuse represented a level of miniaturization and reliability that German industry could not match. He estimated that developing equivalent manufacturing capability would require years and resources Germany did not have. German commanders reacted to proximity fuses with a mixture of professional respect and deep concern. General Heinrich Eberbach, commanding Panzer Group West before his capture in August 1944, was interrogated about German weapons development. Though he had not personally experienced proximity-fused fire, he had been briefed on intelligence reports regarding British anti-aircraft successes against Vohn's II. When American interrogators revealed that the technology was the same proximity fuse used in artillery, Eberbach understood immediately. He asked whether the fuses were being manufactured in large quantities. When told that millions had been produced, Eberbach's response was recorded as a long silence, followed by the statement that Germany had fundamentally misunderstood what it was fighting. Not American soldiers, who could be matched, but American industrial capacity, which could not. The proximity fuse, he said, was the perfect weapon for America, sophisticated enough to provide decisive advantage, but designed for mass production. Germany had sought wonder weapons that would win the war through technological superiority. America had created effective weapons and produced them in overwhelming numbers. The psychological impact of proximity fuses extended beyond their immediate tactical effect. German soldiers facing proximity-fused artillery fire experienced what American intelligence analysts termed artillery shock syndrome, a condition specifically triggered by the helplessness of facing weapons that provided no defense. Some units exhibited discipline problems, with soldiers refusing orders to move into areas under American artillery coverage. German commanders offered rewards for intact proximity fuses, hoping examination might reveal weaknesses or provide insight into countermeasures. By January 1945, Wright Field in Ohio had developed electronic countermeasure systems designed to jam the fuse's radio signals based on the assumption that captured fuses would lead to German jamming efforts. But German engineers never fully grasped what they had captured. Having concluded years earlier that radio-based proximity fuses were impossible given artillery acceleration forces, German technical intelligence did not immediately recognize that miniature radio transmitters were inside every shell. Some German engineers who examined fuse fragments assumed they were looking at components of a mechanical or acoustic system. The concept that delicate vacuum tubes could survive 20,000 G-forces seemed so implausible that they did not seriously consider it. This cognitive blind spot, the assumption that what Germany had concluded was impossible, must be impossible, prevented German countermeasure development. By the time German engineers finally understood the true nature of the proximity fuse in spring 1945, the war was effectively over. Germany lacked the industrial capacity to develop countermeasures, even if the technical understanding had been achieved. The final German assessment of American proximity fuses came from interrogations conducted after Germany's surrender. Major General Walter Dornberger, who had directed the V-2 rocket program, was extensively interrogated by American and British intelligence officers. Among many topics discussed was the V-1 campaign and its failure. Dornberger had not been directly involved in V-1 operations, but as a senior weapons development officer, he had been briefed on the results. When asked about the destruction of 352 Vohn, second in a single week in late August 1944, Dornberger's response was remarkably frank. He stated that this represented the fundamental difference between German and American approaches to weapons development. Germany, he said, had created impressive advanced weapons like the V-2 rocket and the Me-262 jet fighter, but these came too late and in too few numbers to affect the war's outcome. America, Dornberger observed, had created weapons that were advanced enough to be effective, but designed from the beginning for immediate mass production. The proximity fuse exemplified this approach. It required extraordinary miniaturization and sophisticated electronics, but every design decision prioritized manufacturability and reliability. The result was a weapon available in overwhelming numbers when needed. Dornberger was asked whether Germany could have developed equivalent technology. His answer was carefully considered. "Technically, yes," he said. "German." Engineers were capable of solving the miniaturization challenges. Germany had, in fact, developed working prototypes, but Germany could never have manufactured proximity fuzzes in meaningful quantities. The industrial infrastructure required did not exist. Building that infrastructure would have required resources that Germany needed for tanks, aircraft, and basic ammunition. The interrogator pressed further. What if Germany had prioritized proximity fuse development earlier in the war? Dornberger's response was that this would have required recognizing in 1939 or 1940 what the critical technologies would be in 1944 and 1945. Germany had made different choices, investing in offensive weapons like rockets rather than defensive technologies like proximity fuses. Those choices reflected Germany's strategic situation and military doctrine. They could not simply be reversed in retrospect. The conversation turned to the V-1 campaign, specifically. Dornberger acknowledged that if German intelligence had understood British defences were equipped with proximity fuses, the entire V-1 strategy would have been reconsidered. The weapon had been designed to overwhelm defences through numbers. A 70% interception rate made the entire concept uneconomical. Germany had expended enormous resources producing and launching over 9,000 vones second. If those resources had been allocated differently, perhaps to conventional bomber production or to accelerating V2 development, the impact might have been greater. But this was speculation, Dornberger admitted. The fundamental problem was not the V-1 itself, but Germany's inability to match Allied technological and industrial capacity. The proximity fuse was merely one example among many. American radar systems, fire control computers, and logistics capabilities all demonstrated the same pattern. America could produce sophisticated technology reliably and in quantity. Post-war analysis by military historians confirmed Dornberger's assessment. The proximity fuse was one of the key technological advantages that shortened the war. In the Pacific theater, proximity-fused anti-aircraft fire knocked down Japanese aircraft by the hundreds, making kamikaze attacks far less effective and saving thousands of Allied lives. In Europe, proximity-fused artillery reduced the length of campaigns and increased the effectiveness of defensive operations. The specific impact on the V-1 campaign was quantifiable. From June through September 1944, approximately 9,000 vones second were launched against Britain. Without proximity fuses, British defences would have destroyed perhaps 1,700 of these weapons based on pre-fuse interception rates. With proximity fuses, British defences destroyed over 4,000 vones second. The difference, approximately 2,300 additional vones second destroyed, represents 2,300 explosions that did not occur in London and other British cities. Each V-1 carried an 1,870-pound warhead. The explosive force of 2,300 vones second that were prevented from reaching their targets was equivalent to approximately 2,000 tons of high explosive. This represents the destructive power of roughly 800 Lancaster bomber sorties. The lives saved, both military and civilian, numbered in the thousands. But beyond the immediate tactical and strategic impact, the proximity fuse's effect on German commanders' understanding of what they faced was perhaps equally significant. The 352 vones second shot down during the week of August 28 through September 3 represented more than just a military defeat. They represented a revelation. German commanders who had believed the V-1 would be a war-winning weapon, or at least a weapon that could force Britain to negotiate, discovered that American technology had neutralized their most advanced assault weapon. The psychological impact of this discovery rippled through German leadership. If America could defeat the V-1 with technology Germany did not possess and could not develop, what else could America do? The question haunted German strategic planning during the final months of the war. Every assumption about American capabilities had to be reconsidered. Every plan had to account for the possibility that America possessed technological solutions to problems Germany considered unsolvable. This uncertainty, the knowledge that the enemy might deploy technologies beyond German comprehension, contributed to the erosion of German military confidence during the war's final phase. It was not merely that Germany was losing, Germany had been losing battles before and had recovered. What changed in late 1944 and early 1945 was the growing realization among German commanders that they were fighting an enemy with capabilities they could not match. The proximity fuse became a symbol of this disparity. It was not the largest or most powerful weapon America deployed, but it represented something more disturbing than raw firepower. It represented the application of advanced science and unlimited industrial capacity to solve tactical problems. Every German commander who witnessed proximity-fused fire, whether against Von II over Britain or against German forces in the Ardennes, drew the same conclusion. They were not merely outnumbered, they were outproduced, out-engineered, and fundamentally overmatched. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.